This is a talk that's supposed to annoy you. It's okay if you get annoyed. That's the point. And I'm going to talk about deployment in general, not just continuous delivery. Who's doing continuous delivery, by the way? Anybody else? No? Okay. And deployments. Who's deploying code? A lot of people. Great. So why? Why the hell are you doing this? Why are you deploying code? Why are you continuously deploying code? Anybody? Okay, that's a great answer. Something with a little bit more logic. Okay, bug fixes. New features. Customers. Oh, bugs, yeah. Bugs are great. So everybody's talking about deployment and continuous delivery and stuff like this, and it seems that, you know, in every conference you go to, every DevOps conference or DevOps talk or meetup or whatever, somebody's talking about delivery and how great the delivery system is, and they're deploying like 10 times a day or 20 times a second or something crazy like that. And it seems that, you know, it's so popular in these days that like people think DevOps is about delivery. But you know, the reality of things is that deployment is just one more process in production. It's not even that important. You can run a production system for years without having even one deploy. So what's the point? It's actually, the thing is that when you start to think about it, about the processes you have in production, it turns out that not only that you have so many processes, for example, you have transactions, business transactions, you have backups, you have maintenance, you have a lot of automated repair processes, and so on, so on, so on. So, you know, this is actually not only is it such a one-more process, it's even not that important. It's a relatively controllable process. It's not so complicated as other processes we have. For example, if you compare it with you know, business transaction, with the business transaction, you have different, you change the data. You have data mutations. With deployment, not necessarily. With deployment, you sometimes just change the code, but the data stays the same. And for example, with code, you can have a diff. You know exactly what the changes you made to the code. With data, it's very hard to do, especially if you have a lot of data. You can't just diff the data. So deployment is relatively controllable. You decide when to do it. You decide what to do. You decide what components you do it on. You have the guy that wrote the code is working for you. Maybe it's you, you know. And if you compare it with other processes, for example, say you upgraded a database. If you upgrade a database, you didn't write the code. You don't even know the old code. The data is in the database, so there's risk of data mutation. You can't diff the change because it's binary. And all in all, you know, upgrading a database or something like that is much more riskier, is much riskier than, you know, deploying code. And, you know, if you talk about, for example, business transactions, you may be deploying code like 10 times a day, but you have business transactions maybe 1,000 times more a second. I have a system with 1 million transactions per minute, okay? So somebody goes up to me and say, oh, look, I'm deploying code 10 times a day. And I'm like, so? Because I have a process that is so much more uncontrollable than deployment, running so often, so frequently in my system, that I have to worry about. So what is deploying code? It's like nothing. So why is everybody talking about deployment? It's not that complicated, is it? It shouldn't be anyway. So the question is, why do we even deploy? What's the point? And some of you gave part of the answer, I guess. For example, it should bring value. Do deployments always bring value? Anybody? Well, they don't. Not always. They should bring value. Sometimes they bring bugs. Sometimes they bring features that turn out to be, you know, just completely useless. Sometimes we deploy code, and like a day later, the guy from marketing or the PM or something, whatever, comes back to us and says, you know what? The users don't like this feature. We deployed it, now we have to remove it. And this happens very frequently. This is not that uncommon. And sometimes we even have deploys that degrade the platform, degrade value. We have deploy, we have bugs, we have problems, things work slowly, and we have to roll back, or we have to do another deploy to fix the problems that this deploy made. So we don't always have to deploy. We hope it will bring value, it doesn't always do that. And the second reason people deploy code is that it's inventory. You wrote a code, you wrote like 20 lines or maybe a half page or whatever, 3 new classes, 2 different models, and now it's sitting somewhere, and it's inventory. It's stuff you already paid for, you invested the money in building, and it's not bringing any value because it's not running in production. So we want to minimize the amount of time code sits as inventory, and we want to push it to production as fast as possible. And this is one of the reasons we deploy, or at least one of the reasons we want to be deploying. And there actually is a better way to solve this. And the way is just don't write the code unless you need it. Just don't. If you don't need the feature, if you don't know that you need that code in production, don't write it. Don't write code, then let it sit and boil until you push it into production. Instead, pull the features from production to the development team. That way, you only write code that you actually need. And this system is called Kanban. Everybody heard of Kanban, I guess? Anybody? Hands, something? Great, yay. So yeah, Kanban is great. And it's a great solution to this problem of writing code that basically we don't need and forcing the deploy. Some people actually force deploy. They wrote a code, they want to see it in production, and they force everybody, they twist their hands, and they push that code to production, and it usually blows up. So instead, have your PM pull the code from production, pull features from production, then have the guy that is in charge on production pull the code from QA, and have the QA pull the code from developments, from developers. And it makes much more sense. So this is, very common. You go to somebody, to some client or some convention or whatever, people say, we want to be deploying 10 times a day because everybody's doing it. Like Etsy is doing it, Facebook is doing it, they're deploying 100 times a day. We want to be deploying 100 times a day. Right? No. We don't want to be deploying 100 times a day. We don't want to be deploying 1 time a day if we don't need it. Because that's not a good goal. This is a forced goal. This is something that, you didn't need, you didn't think about it. A year ago, if nobody told you about continuous delivery or that you could deploy 10 times a day, you didn't think that you need it. What you actually need is this. You need to be able to deploy whenever you want to. If you're pushing deploys, if you're basically saying, you know what, this can be delayed. Today is not a good day. We're not going to be deploying Sunday or Thursday or Friday because, it's a market day or everybody's home or, I feel lazy today or whatever. It means the deployment is too hard for you or it's too risky. And basically, you lost your operational freedom, which is exactly what deployment is about. If you're pushing deploys, that's your problem. Not the amount of deployments you do per day. If you need to be deploying once a week, then that's your goal. To be able to deploy at the exact minute when you need to. If you have a bug and you need to fix it now, it doesn't matter if you can deploy 10 times a day. If you can't deploy it now, you're fucked. So this is the goal you should be striving to. And this brings me to the big question of why is deployment such a big deal? Why is everybody talking about deployment as if it's such a hard problem? I mean, we've seen that looking at it in, with perspective, it shouldn't be a hard problem. We have bigger problems that we've dealt with. So why is it such a big deal? Suggestions, anybody? Okay. So you're developers, right? You write code. And I guess that if you wrote the code, you want to see it in action, right? You don't want the code to be sitting on your laptop or on your IntelliJ or whatever ID you use and do nothing. So basically, deploy is the highlight of the sprint. And this is one of the reasons that we have such a big deal about deployments, what makes so much noise and so on. The other reason, which is kind of nasty to say it, but it's, well, pretty true, that catastrophe is very noisy, but success is silent. The only people who talk about delivery are the people that found delivery to be a very hard and bad thing. People that do delivery very well, you don't hear them. They don't even talk. They don't come to conferences and say that, tell you this amazing success story of how they went from catastrophe to success. It was never a catastrophe to begin with, so there's no story. You almost never hear people from Google, for example, tell you about their deployment system, which is awesome, by the way, because there's no point. It was always awesome. So that's one more thing. Most talks are, just come out of pain. And we should learn from it. We should learn that deployment shouldn't be a big deal. If you do it properly, if you do continuous delivery properly, then the main logic behind continuous delivery is small increments to make every increment count less and be less painful. And that's the point. If you have a pretty good deploy system, then this is not true for you. Deployment is no longer a big deal. You're not going to be talking at conferences. You're not going to be saying stuff like, look, I'm deploying and stuff like this, because it's no longer an issue. But for most of us, it's still an issue. And it turns out that the reasons that deployment is such a big deal for most companies, for places where deployment isn't done properly, is a bunch of reasons that has nothing to do with deploy. It's basically a symptom of other systemic problems. For example, fragility. You deploy something and the system breaks. Did it break because of the deploy? No. It broke because your system is fragile. Your system would break if I kicked it. It would break if I took it down the server. It would break if I twisted a knob. It would break from just about anything. So of course deployment breaks it, because anything does. So another reason is architecture. You hear a lot of people debating about what's the proper way of deploying. Should you push the code? Should you pull the code? Can you deploy to all the servers at once? Do you have to deploy one server at a time? Do you need a canary test? And it turns out that this is strongly related to architecture. For example, I went to this conference about a year and a half ago, DevOps Con in Tel Aviv, and somebody tweeted from the conference that, yeah, they're talking about deployment tools and automation tools and blah, 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 but nobody's telling us about tools that allow you to automatically change schema while deploying. Well, of course not, because it's an architecture problem. If you need to be changing the schema of your database during deployment, there won't be a tool to do that. And even if there was a tool, you wouldn't want to use it, because the data models are tied up to the application. It's part of the application. It's an inherent thing of the architecture. And if your architecture doesn't support using two different data models at once, then you can't do it. And it's not about any automation tool or any other tool, and you just have to fix the architecture. And that is also true about other aspects of deployment. For example, push versus pull. If you pull changes, then it's asynchronous. And if it's asynchronous, then you would have some instance where different servers would have different versions of the application. And to support multi-version operation, you have to have the architecture to support it. So yeah, you need to fix the architecture. It's a systemic problem. It's not a problem of deployment. And we all know this, of course. I mean, everybody who worked at the big company knows the organizational issues. Departments don't work well together, for example. Risk management is very bad. You go to someone and say, I need to be deploying, and he's saying something like, well, it's dangerous, you can't do it. Everything's going to break. There's going to be an asteroid crossing the moon, hitting the server farm at exactly the instant you deploy. Yeah, it's a risk. Is it a valid risk? Probably not. So yeah, we have organizational issues. We have managers that don't do their job properly. We have departments that don't cooperate properly. We have excessive risk management. We have crazy regulations. We have a bunch of stuff that is basically making deploys very, very hard to do. Is it related to deploys? Well, it does, because it affects deploys. Does it originate from deploys? No. It's a systemic problem. Methodologies. That's another big problem. The guy before me, Evgeny, spoke about configuration management. If you want to do deploys well, you need configuration management. Do everybody have configuration management? No. Should they have it? Yes. Is it a problem that is related to the delivery? Well, no. It's a systemic problem that affects delivery. So yeah, we need to fix that as well. And the biggest problem of all is culture, which is why I'm here today, actually. Culture is one of the biggest problems with deploys. Because, for example, we think deploy is our problem. It's not anybody else's problem. Yeah, I'm deploying code, but should I tell QA about it? Well, no. Should I tell IT about it? Definitely not. It's not their issue. They don't care about it. They don't even send code. Should I tell the operations team about it? Well, I have to, because otherwise they won't deploy. Well, a good culture where we share data, where we share what we do and why we do it, that culture is called DevOps. And if you have DevOps, if you have the culture of DevOps, then deployments are going to be it's going to be a lot easier. And the tools will grow out of it. DevOps is not about tools, but tools are one of the symptoms. Good tools are one of the symptoms of DevOps. Because if you put one guy from operations and one guy from the development department and another guy from QA, and you sit them down in a room, and you close the door, and you give them like an hour to try to solve a problem, they're probably going to end up with the tool. Because that's what we do. We code. We try to code to solve our problems. So if you have a culture where people share and try to work together, then you're bound to end up with tools. But tools are a symptom. They're not the way to fix it. The first thing you have to fix is the culture. If your culture is an anti-deployment culture, a culture where you go to the guy that is in charge of production and say something like, look, I need to deploy code, blah, 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 and upgrade, package X, and maybe the database, and you know what, the operating system is like 5 years old, doesn't support what I need, we need to be upgrading the operating system too, and he's saying something like, no, we can't change anything in production. Production is going to burn, it's going to crash. Then you have a cultural issue. And you need to deal with that cultural issue before you can do anything else. It's impossible to fix deploys if you have a cultural problem. And, I see a bunch of people yawning in the audience, so I guess that you just want to get this over with and go deploy something. Let's talk about what deployment is really about. Deployments are fuzzy, which means that the boundaries of deploy are pretty unclear. People think that I'm going to deploy something here, and the rest of the system is going to be unaffected. Is this true? No. We have side effects. We change the dynamics of the system when we deploy. And this sounds very scary. We change the way the system behaves. But it turns out that a lot of other stuff does change the dynamics of the system too. This is why we call those systems complex systems, because we can't predict what will change the dynamics of the system. It's a problem. We know how to deal with it. And if your architecture is good, then that problem should be mitigated to some degree, I guess. Deployments are not time-scoped. We know exactly when we trigger the deploy. We know when the deploy starts. When is it finished? When we're done deploying code? When customers start to use the system? When we get feedback from the customers about the features we deployed? When is it over? When we do the next deploy? When we roll back? So it turns out that the end of the deploy is completely subjective. And that also means that you can have two overlapping deployments. Because, for example, if you decided that this feature is not, the deployment of that feature isn't over yet because you haven't yet received feedback, but you have to deploy a bug fix for another feature, then you would have two overlapping deploys. And this actually happens very, very often. So you have to understand that this is part of the complexity of deployment, just defining the boundaries and time scopes. And a lot of people talk about tools and how to deliver code from to a bunch of different servers. Do we use Chef? Do we use Puppet? Do we use Fabric? Do we use Capistrano or whatever? This is bogus. This is a bogus problem. Delivering code to servers is not a real problem unless you have 100K servers. If you don't have 100,000 servers and you're deploying to all of them at once, then it's a bogus problem. It's been solved like 20 years ago. There's really no point in debating whether Chef or Puppet or whatever is better for you. Whatever is good for you, just use it. You could do it with scripts. You could do it with torrents. You could use it. You could use Git. You could do whatever crazy thing you want. That's not the problem of deployment. Deployment is not about file distribution. Deployment is about control. What does this mean? The biggest problem of deployment is how do I get the status of what's going on? You know, which servers deployed, which servers loaded, what version are they using? Do all of my servers have the new version, for example? It's about monitoring, it's about telemetry, it's about orchestration, which means controlling the order and the timing of steps. It's about understanding the way the system behaves. What happens if I have two concurrently different versions? Do things break? Do I have uncontrolled data mutations? And so on. So once we understand that, we also understand that deployment is mostly about architecture. You know, all the stuff I mentioned before and a lot of other things. How to make the system less fragile, not just for deployment, but for everything else. And the bottom line of all of this is that there will never, ever, ever be a tool that solves deployment problems. If you have a deployment tool, yeah, it's an aid. It's a good aid. It's a great tool. It might save you some time. It might help with control. But you should be investing in monitoring tools instead. If you have good monitoring, which you need for debugging and malfunctions and other stuff, then chances are it's going to help with deployments too. You want to have orchestration tools. You want to have control tools. But you want to have them regardless of deploy. You can use them for deploy, because deploy is, after all, about orchestration and control and monitoring. But they're not just for deploy. And the thing I want to stress the most is just don't do it unless you have to. And when you have to, you need to do it now. So you want to have the operational freedom, and you want to have the ability to deploy whenever you want, and not shy away from deployments because of whatever reason. If you're doing it, then it's a sure sign you have a problem, a systemic problem, not a problem of deployment. So the last thing I'm going to say about deployments is that, for me at least, you know, I go to a lot of clients, and I'm actually a consultant. I haven't said that before. I work with a lot of clients, and every client think that their problem is unique. And almost every client I work with is searching for some kind of tool to help them with their deployment problem, and it's a mistake. Because it's not a unique problem, and it's not, it's basically a symptom of other systemic problems. You don't want to have specialized tools for deployments. You don't. Because if you have specialized tools for deployments, you've created a new problem. You've created a problem of having a tool that doesn't coexist with the rest of the system. Its behavior is different, and basically you can only use it for one thing, which isn't even really important. And you could do deploys with other tools as well. So, for example, if you have configuration management tools, although they're not tools for deployments, you can use them at least in part for deployments. If you have an orchestration tool, if you have a remote control tool, you can definitely use that for deployment. It's a great idea, and you should do it. What you shouldn't be doing is investing a lot of money in a specialized tool. So thank you very much. I hope you're all annoyed. If not, I'll try again later on, and I'll see you later.